Welcome, everybody. It's 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we're going to get started with our monthly Kids Grief Q&A. I'm Andrea Warnick, and I'm a member of the clinical team at Canadian Virtual Hospice. I also, with my colleague Colleen, who's here, we run a mutual group practice together of grief therapists. And really, we share a passion in supporting kids who are grieving, families who have somebody dying, supporting adults too. But for today's purposes, we're really going to be focusing on how to support kids who are grieving a death or dying in their life. We will get sort of the slides into the chat box for you momentarily. We're down a person right now. Right before we opened it up, we had Leah, our intake coordinator, with us too, and she somehow got ejected, and she was going to be doing the background stuff. So you might just have to hang with us. But you've got Colleen and I, and I'm coming to you today from Guelph, Ontario. And so I'm on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations of the Anishinaabe people. And one of the things that we've really been trying to do in our family more is learn the stories of the people who were living in this land, and that this land was home to long before my ancestors ever came here as settlers. We're currently reading, this is with my 12-year-old, but a beautiful book by Jennifer Dance called Hawk. I can't remember if I'd already started it last month and shared it, but it's an incredible story, which really speaks to me. It's about a story of a young Indigenous youth who gets cancer. My own background is a pediatric nurse long before I became a psychotherapist. But really weaving in some of the incredibly grief-stricken reality of the impact that we are having on our land and nature. And there's parts in my 12-year-old sometimes it's like, don't read that part about the osprey and what happens. And it's heart-wrenching to read elements of this story. Beautifully, beautifully written book. But certainly opening a lot of important conversations in our family as well. I'm going to let Colleen introduce herself, and then we're going to jump in to our Q&A. And really the goal of our time together at these Q&As are just to be able to answer any questions that you might have about supporting grieving children and youth.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Colleen Musso. I'm a registered psychotherapist, co-own and run Andrea Warnick Consulting with Andrea. We've got a brilliant team of 30 therapists. We're all doing this work and supporting around grief and death and dying. I personally support children, youth, and adults of all ages, including those who are neurodiverse, so those with autism spectrum disorder, ADHD. And I'm coming at you today from my home in Hamilton, which is the traditional territory of the Erie Neutral Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. And I'm loving this time of year. I've got 3 young boys who are very close to the ground. They're 4, 2, and 2. And we're just exploring new life that's coming through the earth. So little things that are sprouting up from the ground, also things that have died and have been hiding under the snow that's just melted away. And it's, I'm challenged all the time in how we're talking about life and death through the eyes of my little guys. And I'm loving the opportunity to do that as we're exploring our backyard and the lands around us.
And so as we get started, we really want to invite everyone to introduce yourself in the chat. We always love to know where people are coming from. And I mean, the purpose of this time together is to answer your questions. And we're conscious of, a lot of the times, it's sort of pretty even split, I find, often between professionals or volunteers doing the work and families who are here personally supporting their children who are grieving as well. And so just love to get an idea of who you are, where you're coming from. If you know the traditional territory that you're on, please, let us know that as well. And we'll get started in just a moment. While people are doing that, I'm going to get the slides up, and I'm also going to pop the slides into the chat box for people to be able to download if you're interested. I just ask everybody to sort of keep in mind as well, though, that really this isn't meant to be a webinar. This is meant very much to be a Q&A where we're answering your questions. And so many of the slides we likely won't even speak to at all, unless nobody's asking questions. And then I'm going to start sort of running through them. I can see we've got Jennifer from Burnaby, BC. That's great. Palliative team, social worker. Oh, that just came through to us. Okay, so I might read these out. I don't know. I'm not seeing any other intros, and I'm not sure that we actually have.
The chat is disabled. Simone usually does something really special to help us interact with our chat.
I know, and we did. Okay, some more is coming through. I think we've just got everything set up to come through directly to us, and I think we're just going to stick to that for today, because I don't think Colleen and I should mess with anything on the technical side. But I'll just read out. We've also got maybe what I'll do to protect confidentiality. I'm not even going to say names, but just you know, the introduction that people have included. I'm a grieving mom taking care of a 10-year-old and wanting to learn how to support her. Welcome. Anybody else like to do an intro? We will read those out. And what we'll ask is just any questions that you've got, pop them into the chat box. And so, or you can put them in the Q&A. I will keep an eye on both of those. So there's also the Q&A box. This is being recorded. And for those of us who were here last month, I know that some people had asked about where to actually watch the recording of past months, and I wasn't actually sure. And so I got on the Kids Grief website. So it's literally kidsgrief.ca. And if you scroll down to the bottom there, which is where you can also register for this Q&A if you're not already on the list, there is the recording from last month. So that's where Virtual Hospice is posting the recording all of the time. And so if you're ever missing the previous month, you can go check it out there. And if you've got questions and you know you can't attend live, please know that you can email the questions in. They send them to us the day before, and we'll start off with your questions. But for today's purposes, nobody emailed questions in. So please do, anybody who's coming with a question today, please just pop it in that Q&A or the chat box. Okay. Oh, you can chat with everybody. So that is great. I'm seeing more of these introductions coming in, which is wonderful. I just want to highlight a few more of the resources as well through Canadian Virtual Hospice, because I mean, this is such an important resource that's available really around the world. There's some extra pieces that are available to people who are in Canada, such as Ask a Professional, where, if it's between the middle of the month or something, and you've got a question about supporting a grieving child, you can go to Ask a Professional, send your question in. Again, for this one, you do need to live in Canada. And basically get an answer like that'll get sent to our team or one of the other children's clinicians, and you get a confidential answer within 3 business days. And this is true too of anything related to palliative care, hospice care, advanced illness. And so there's physicians on the clinical team, there's pediatric palliative care physicians, nurse practitioners, chaplains, a wide array of professionals. But in terms of some of the resources that are available worldwide, youthgrief.ca, developed last year by our good friend Kelly Eaton Russell, with a number of youth who are grieving themselves. So lots of lived experience informing this resource. They've also got a number of, these are all free workbooks on the kidsgrief.ca website. That can be downloaded for kids who either have a serious illness themselves, somebody else in their life has a serious illness, or somebody in their world might be experiencing a death through medical assistance in dying, which is legalized right across Canada now. So I'm not seeing any questions so far. I'm actually going to jump ahead, and this might be where if you see a slide and you're like, I want, I've got questions about the slide or what I just saw in there, please know you are most welcome to ask questions about any of these slides. But I'm actually going to jump ahead right now to first of all, sort of a go-to article for me. And then I'm going to jump ahead to the concept of the 5 C's, which is really something that if I only see a child once, because I know some people working with kids who quite frequently come to this platform, like might only see a child once, or maybe you're working with a parent who is seriously ill or dying and don't even have direct contact with a child. But I think there's a few important pieces that we all want to have on our radar, even if we just once come in contact with a grieving child. But first, I want to highlight this article because this really is my go-to article right now. Both Colleen and I, as grief therapists, work with both kids and adults. We kind of span the age span. And one of the things that I like to emphasize early when I'm talking to parents is that, unlike 20 years or any time ago or any time prior in history, we actually have like a pretty strong body of literature right now on best practice for supporting kids who are grieving, whether it's their own death or whether it's somebody else who's dying in their life. And I do find that for a lot of people, they kind of perk up at that. And that's where I really like to ask as well. Would you like to see some of this literature? And if the answer is yes, this is kind of where I'm going. There's great books out there. Phyllis Silverman has Never Too Young to Know, Death in Children's Lives, also Parenting Grieving Children, which is phenomenal. But these are pretty like thick, intense books that, most of the families we're supporting are not in a space where they're able to pick up like a 200 or 300 page book. And this is where I find this article is very much, it's very concise. It's referencing 2 much broader lit searches. One looking specifically at best practice for sharing information with children who are dying themselves, and one looking specifically at children who have somebody else dying in their life. And essentially what they come back saying is that best practice is to speak openly, speak honestly, when a child's dying themselves or when a child has somebody else dying. And I find for the majority of the families I'm supporting, really, this is all they want. I don't think most of those families are actually going and doing a dive into the literature after that or into those lit searches that they're referencing, but it's good to know that they're there for the people who do want to do a deeper dive. So, and this is where I'm going to invite too, now that we've established that we can all chat in the chat box, if there's any resources that you love to work to use when you're working with or supporting your own grieving children, please throw them in the chat box. I think one of the beauties of this platform is the opportunity for us all just to be able to learn from each other. And so please don't hesitate to throw any of the resources into the chat box. Colleen, if I'm missing questions or anything at any point, you'll tell me, right?
We will, yeah. And Leah's here.
Oh, Leah, you're here. That's great. Welcome, Leah, however you did that. And so maybe instead of me trying to multitask, we'll get Leah to throw in the slides in the chat box for everybody too, if anybody wants to print them out. So I'm just going to jump ahead here because I'd love to spend a few minutes. I know I often reference them, and I also see some names. I think we might have some new people to this platform or to our time together as well. But I often reference the 5 C's, but I'd really like to be able to spend a few minutes on them because to me, this is a really important piece of, anytime you encounter a grieving child. And I know I often share the story of my cousin who she was 5 when her mom died, and it wasn't until she was 30 that I actually found out that she'd gone through her entire schooling trying not to make new friends. And when I asked her about that, my assumption was that she didn't, if kids asked her about, where's your mom, which inevitably comes up, that her concern would be saying my mom died. And I've certainly worked with a lot of kids who that is a very big concern for them. But in her case, what she said is she actually didn't know how her mom died. She didn't know that her mom had died from cancer, or that it was even cancer. And when I asked her, well, why didn't you ever ask your dad about that? Her response was, I saw him so devastated when my mom died. I never wanted to make him sad. And for that little tidbit right there, there's so many different teaching points, but I do think one of the ones I want to draw attention to is that is a very common concern for kids, that if they start talking about the person who's seriously ill or the person who's died, that they're going to make the other people, particularly adults in their life who, they're caregivers. And I'm going to use the language of parents throughout our time together, but I'm really speaking to anybody who's raising a child, whether this is foster dad or grandma. And a lot of kids worried, if I bring up my dad who died and, my other parent starts crying, I've made them sad. And that's where I think it's so important to really be able to let kids know, even if you don't think they're grappling with this, that, what, if you talk about the person who died and I tear up or start crying, I want you to know you've not made me any more sad than I already am. You're actually helping me get these feelings out, and just doing sort of a reframe with them. In terms of the 5 C's, this is where across the board, like I want to ensure that kids know that they're not responsible for the illness and the death in any way. I could literally, I'm sure Colleen and I together could write a really thick book on all the things we've heard about why why kids think they've caused either the illness or the death in their family. This fear of, can I catch it, is really huge as well. And I find, that's always been a big one for kids. Will I get the cancer or the ALS if I touch them? And often I'm saying one of the only good things I know about cancer, ALS, or whatever the disease is that you can't catch it from somebody. You can hug them, you can kiss them. I think of one little girl who I was working with, and this one really caught me off guard. This was early into my grief counseling career, and this was a family who was mom was in the hospital. Mom was quite close to dying, but still awake and involved in conversation and everything. And I went through the 5 C's with dad. And dad stopped me and was like, are you sure she can't catch it, that we won't catch it? And I was like, absolutely sure. And it really hadn't been on my radar that sometimes there might be adults who might be confused about that as well. And it turned out that, his concern that his daughter could get the cancer from mom had translated into him, telling his daughter not to hug her, not to kiss her, not to get into bed with her, not to, like, really this disconnection, physical disconnection that was coming from such a loving and protective place. And English wasn't their first language, but he was very fluent. And again, I was kind of caught off guard, and it was a good reminder for me that these are important conversations to have with adults as well. In that situation, I was in an oncology center, and I didn't want to take a chance. I actually asked that the oncologist come in and sort of reiterate this conversation to make sure that, dad could feel assured that his daughter could kiss her mom and get in bed with her mom and share food with her mom. But I'm so glad that we caught that. And it was really quite accidental because dad happened to be in the room when I was having the conversation.
I think it's an easy mistake to make when there is often a lot of extra care for the people around someone who, as they're dying, or even while they're undergoing, let's say if we're speaking specifically about cancer and treatment, where there is likely to be an immune suppressed system, right? So we're extra care is provided around, like making sure we're washing hands and we're not going around somebody if we've got a cold or flu, or if we have knowledge of being unwell. And so how quickly young people, but even adults, if they don't have this extra information, can assume then there is some contagious factor here, or that I'm also at risk of making the cancer worse or making the illness worse. So there's anxiety kind of two-way around that contact, which then ends up not feeling good for anybody, because you then keep the space, or you don't actually get the snuggles or the time together for fear of both contracting an illness or making it worse. So it's super important to have these conversations with the right information.
And I'd say even more so in this age of COVID-19 too, where, the fear around, getting a disease or getting COVID from somebody is a very real thing. And so we've got kids even more concerned. I've certainly seen that anxiety heightened in kids through COVID-19. So, really addressing that with kids. Could I have cured it, right? Could I have done something to make it better? Can I do something to make it better? Right? I've worked with kids who have had private pacts with gods that their parents didn't even know they believed in around, like, if you keep my brother alive, like, I'll never fight with them again. And invariably that pact gets broken, and so it's a very quick conclusion for kids in lack of, in the absence of other conversation where it's being emphasized that this is not something that you can control. It's easy for them to jump I broke my pact, my brother died, this is my fault, becoming their narrative. Right. And so kids, there's all kinds of creative things I've heard from kids as to how they thought in some way they could have cured it, but they didn't try hard enough. And I think too, and we were having a conversation about this on our team this morning as well, just this whole language around, the battle rhetoric, which is used in a lot of different places, but I'd say really heightened in cancer care. The fight against cancer, giving up the fight, fighting the battle, all of that battle rhetoric, which can be so unhealthy and completely inaccurate. Like, I like to be really clear with the kids that I work with is that, this isn't a matter, whether it's the child who has the illness themselves or somebody else does, of you or of your person not trying hard enough, right? Sometimes with illnesses, or I'll say cancer, sometimes all of our treatments are stronger than the cancer. Sometimes the cancer is stronger than all of the treatment. Whether you live or die, or whether your person lives or dies, is not a reflection of how hard they did or didn't try. And we have so much language in our culture that goes exactly against that rhetoric, which is incredibly unhelpful for children and for adults. This who is going to take care of me? I find that the majority, like vast majority of kids who, if they have a parent who's seriously ill, if they're even in a 2-parent family in the first place, or a parent who has died, that one is heightened around, what happens if something happens to, my surviving parent? Who's going to take care of me? I think of one of the first families I ever worked with when I was at the Dr. J Children's Grief Center. A parent had died in an accident, and little guy, like, on the way to the funeral, and then quite consistently afterwards, just being like, asking mom, if you die, who's going to take care of me? And mom just didn't have the wherewithal to have that conversation. I would go and do home sessions, and he'd be like, Andrea, if my mom dies, like, can I stay with you? Like, he was asking people out on the street. And this is where the work really was with mom, to be able to engage in that conversation and to be able to assure him that most likely, which we are fortunate most of the time to be able to say with some degree of accuracy, most likely I'm going to live to be old enough that you're not going to need me to take care of you by the time something happens to me, or by the time I die. But if something were to happen to you, or were to happen to me, and I couldn't take care of you, this is who your guardians are. And it's one of the first conversations I often have with the families I work with often before, I even see the kids, is just asking them, do you have guardians selected for your kids? Are your kids aware of that? Because it tends to it's anxiety provoking, I find, for adults sometimes having that conversation, but for most kids, I find it tends to bring their anxiety down quite quickly. I can see Amy say that, and Amy, welcome Amy. Amy's on our team as well. I've had children get confused too when they overhear that the cancer has spread. They think that it means that the cancer is contagious, and it can be helpful to clarify this. That is such a good point. And that's where, when we're teaching kids about cancer, like, I like to get down to the nitty gritty and like be pulling up pictures of cells or Play-Doh, making cells out of Play-Doh and things like that. And sometimes what I'll talk about is, that cancer travels, and it can start in, mom's breast, but it could actually, maybe it's traveled to her brain. right? But I think to Amy's point, we want to make sure, even if we're having that conversation about metastases, cancer spreading, that we're really clear with kids that that is an internal process. I had a kid, this wasn't long ago, who was like, well, it's skin cancer, and I'm sure if I touch the skin cancer, I'll get it. I was like, nope, even if you can see it, even if you touch it, you will not get cancer from touching your person's skin cancer. And then this last piece, which is really a huge one, and I know that there's a number of feelings and thoughts on our team in terms of the 5th C or even a 6th C. I can't remember it. Colleen, you might know some of the other ones that have been proposed as well. But generally I use, how will I stay connected, right? And this means, what does it look like to stay connected with my person as they're dying? It's not uncommon, both in my experience as a psychotherapist, but also as a nurse, where, because I was in oncology and palliative care, it was common to see kids get sort of disconnected, right? Prematurely disconnected from their person who was dying, whether it was siblings who were no longer really visiting because they didn't know how to be with their sibling who was dying, or a kid who had a parent or grandparent dying. And that's where I think it's really important, before a death happens, to figure out, what does it look like to stay connected? Maybe you can't play hockey with dad, but maybe you can lie in the bed and watch hockey with dad. Or in COVID, when so many people couldn't be at the bedside, what does it look like to still foster connection when you can't physically be there, right? And that's where we can get creative with all kinds of, activities, everything from kid hugging a teddy bear, and then the teddy bear goes into hospice. Our team has always done a lot of hugs, where it's just a strip off the linen cart and tracing arms and then sending them in. That can go into ICU, your hug for your person, even if you can't be there. But the other piece about, how will I stay connected, which I don't think we talk about often enough, is, what does it look like to stay connected after somebody has died as well? And I think I speak for Colleen and Amy, and Amy's done a beautiful piece on continuing bonds, for just education within our team and work that she does in her practice and everything. But I think as well, but this is such an important conversation, and really speaks to a lot of the sort of more long-term work that I find myself doing with families, is helping them figure out, like, what does it mean in our society, where we don't have so many rituals strongly, woven into the fabric of our society, to actually stay connected with my person, not just days and weeks after they've died, but throughout the rest of my life.
Can I talk about the 6th C?
Yeah, I can't remember what you're
up for debate.
Yeah.
But I will include a communication plan.
Right.
And so that looks like, a million different things. So if working with somebody with special needs, for example, then there's going to be, before you even start the work, how is this person communicating with the people in their life and their needs and their wants and all these kinds of things. But with all kids, I also want to make sure that there's a clear plan after we've gone through the 5 C's of how are they accessing information now moving forward. So hopefully at this point, we've got, a clearer sense of prognosis. What does that mean? But how is new information going to be communicated? Who is going to be communicating with them? Do they have somebody that they prefer to ask questions of as they arise? Knowing that these are not just singular conversations, but kids are processing in a continuous way that's going to come up more kind of in popcorn style. We're going to have key people that they know they can get some accurate information from. And even as the therapist, I'm admitting to kids that I may not actually have the answers, but I'm going to work really hard to make sure we get the right information. So any questions, go. And we'll work together to get those answers, trying to empower caregivers to have a similar response. It's okay not to have the answers. It's okay not to know everything possible that a kid may be wondering about a particular type of illness. This also includes if I'm supporting a child after someone in their life has died, knowing, again, there's going to be questions that arise as time goes on. Maybe the type of death needs to be talked about only with certain people who understand or have that clarity in how the death occurred. these tend to be in some of the more disenfranchised types of death that would be like suicide or an overdose, homicide, and that kind of thing, that we may not have the ability to just ask anybody, teacher at school or someone passing on the street, right? That we're really wanting to make sure that the child knows there are people who can talk about this or would be able to get some of those answers, as opposed to others in your life who you may be identifying as knowledgeable adults, they may not actually know about this particular thing.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I do think that that's a big piece of like, you know, and also like just who do you want to get your information by? How do you want to get your information? You know, I like to ask kids when I'm talking to them, you know, my general go-to is there's never too early to tell a child that somebody has a serious illness in your life, even if we don't know if the person's going to die from it or not. It's okay to say to kids, if they nail you with the question right off, like, are they going to die like Terry Fox? Which I find for most kids in Canada from 4 up, like Terry Fox tends to be a reference point around cancer. But it could be, you know what, we're really hoping not. There's a bunch of treatments that, you know, can be tried. You want to know about some of them. But if I were, you know, to be worried, or if my doctors or healthcare team were to let me know that they think that I might die from this, like, we're going to let you know, and just be honest with them about that. But if I'm working with a family and we know the person's going to die, even if it's going to be a while and we don't know when this is going to happen, could even be years, I like to ask kids, like, are you the type of person who, like, you want to know what to expect? Like, would it be helpful if I kind of walked you through what it might look like as dad's getting closer to dying? Or would you, you know, prefer to wait until we're closer to that time to have that conversation? And I find in any family of multiple siblings, you're going to have very different informational needs. Some kids want all the information right now. Some kids want none of it. So you might be separating out some of those conversations too. I can see we've got a question here. Great question. Can you touch upon grief versus mental health? I often hear the term complex grief and wondering when something is just regular grief or if further mental health supports are needed. And so, yeah, I mean, this is a big conversation right now. And I know certainly, you know, even in terms of the work of virtual hospice, Canadian Virtual Hospice through the pandemic really started this Canadian Grief Alliance, and which was very much advocating, you know, to the government that are in Canada, our grief specific services are patchwork at best, right? Most communities don't have grief specific services available, and certainly not free grief specific services. And so, you know, we were really advocating, as a part of that alliance, we were really advocating to the government for funding for grief programs, because many of them are charitable organizations on a shoestring budget. And the response kept being like, well, we're funding mental health. We're funding mental health. And this to me reflects a little bit of, or more than a little bit, of grief illiteracy, because our response was very much, you know, grief isn't a mental health condition, right? Like, grief is a natural aspect of being a human being. It's a natural experience when somebody in your life, or whenever you experience a significant loss, right? And so the vast majority of grief is healthy. It's not a mental health condition. And if you look at most mental health organizations, they don't have grief specific services. And I say most because our team just last week did a 2-day kids grief education day that was sort of open to the public. And I noted there, I was like, there was somebody, I think it was from Windsor, Ontario, who worked at CMHA, the Canadian Mental Health Organization, and they in fact did have a Grief Works program, which does work with kids who are grieving in the community, which I was pretty excited about, but doesn't tend to be the norm. And that's where, you know, I think it's important, even when we're individually supporting kids who are grieving, is to help them understand that grief is really hard. Like, it is really hard, but it is natural. It's healthy, you know, and part of the complexity of grief is that in allowing ourselves to actually do it and find safe spaces to experience it, it actually serves us well in the bigger picture than if we just constantly try to avoid it. But that doesn't mean grief can't turn into a mental health condition, and certainly in the States, and I mean, even in Canada to degree, for a long time, the language was being used complicated grief. And then quite recently, the DSM, which is the main diagnostic manual in the States that is used, and they added prolonged grief disorder. So this just happened like quite recently. And the one thing that I would say has been beneficial is that prior to that, the language of complicated grief was being used largely in the States. The World Health Organization was using prolonged grief disorder. Like everybody was using different terms, and now they've sort of brought it all into line. And really the language about when grief starts becoming, when it is a mental health condition, is called, for better or for worse, there's a lot of strong feelings about this, prolonged grief disorder. And here in Canada, and I know we do have, yes, Amina, who asked the question, you are in the States. So, it might be a bit of a little bit of a different discourse in the States right now, because, there are more implications in terms of actually receiving a diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, opening up the doors to some treatments and insurance and things like that. Where in Canada, that is not as much of an issue. But what I would say is that I actually feel it's very important that people who are clinically doing work with people who are grieving to have on our radar as to like when grief may no longer be healthy. It might not even be that, if the person was in the States, that they'd meet the criteria for prolonged grief disorder. But you certainly want to know when it's starting to look like, when it's starting to get to the point that it might not be healthy. And I'm actually going to turn it to the group right now and just invite people to like throw into the chat box, like, what are some of the things that you might be worried about? Or if you saw, you might be, okay, this might be a point where grief maybe isn't healthy. And this person needs some more support. And
while I'm just going to add a little bit too, because I think, what we see so commonly in our practice is that, we are a grief specific practice. And so the referrals that we receive are in response to either somebody with a serious illness or after a death has occurred. But a lot of the folks that we support in the practice, that they're pre-existing challenges with mental health, whether or not they've been diagnosed, but let's say anxiety or depression, different ways that they, had been functioning in the world is really upended in their grief experience, right? So it's been magnified. Some of the worries that they've been experiencing previously are really very much on the surface. So it does, as a clinician, it becomes quite challenging to tease it apart. And as time goes on, I would say it becomes a little more apparent in how some of those underlying issues are coming to the surface. And we don't usually get that snapshot of the way that things felt before and now where they are currently. Individuals can often describe that and say that grief actually feels a whole lot like my anxiety. I've just got all of these new fears and worries or new sources of panic and that kind of thing. So it's not as maybe neat and tidy. I'd say in the role of a diagnostician, of which we're not, it does also become really challenging, which is why these conversations are really quite hot, is trying to figure out how to make those clear distinctions between, if you look at the symptom checklist of someone with depression and the symptom checklist of somebody who's grieving, there's a whole bunch of overlap. And so at one point in time, there had been this exclusionary criteria where somebody couldn't be diagnosed with depression if they were also experiencing grief within a certain window. And you probably have that. It
was a 2-month window. Like
2-month window.
That happened in 2 months. Yeah, this was in the US.
So there's pros and cons in order for that to be, for some people, it means that they would actually have access to medical leave from a workplace, which is going to benefit them. Whereas a lot of bereavement leaves are limited to 2 or 3 days, but the the stigmatizing factors underneath that are also, I mean, a part of the conversation too. It's a really good question with a whole lot of murky answers, I guess is where I'm landing here.
Well, and that's where, I think the estimates for the percentage of the population who experiences prolonged grief disorder is about 10%. So essentially what they're saying is that 90% of people experiencing grief tends to be healthy grief. Doesn't mean that there's not some benefits to support and things like that. But about 10% of the population is it tends to experience what we would call prolonged grief disorder. And I think to what Colleen was speaking to as well, there's actually a lot of complexity because around the fact that often people who do have prolonged grief disorder, and again, as psychotherapists, Colleen and I can't diagnose, but clinically, certainly I have an idea of when I'm like working with somebody where there's some stuck points, right? And I feel like they might actually meet that criteria, or maybe they don't, but I still know that there's stuck points, and that's where there's a strong body of research showing that prolonged grief disorder or a stuck point in your grief often gets misdiagnosed as depression. And that treatment for depression is way less effective to somebody who's actually grieving and the source of the distress is rooted in their grief than is like if they actually get targeted grief support, way more effective than getting treated for depression. And the unfortunate reality is that most people do not know how to recognize when somebody might be getting in a stuck place in their grief or prolonged grief disorder. And so it's often misdiagnosed as depression and people don't get grief-specific support, which is problematic as well. I would just sort of mention that the APA in the United States, the American Psychiatric Association, they've put out their criteria. And if anybody can find that, I know I've already got Leah looking for another resource as well to pop into the chat. I'd love to get the Irish Child Bereavement Pyramid into the chat, but also if somebody wants to pull out for the APA and their criteria for prolonged grief disorder, I mean, it's pretty clearly laid out. And it's really when you're getting into it's interfering with your daily life and your ability to actually be a part of your life. And it's pretty all-consuming by the time we're looking at prolonged grief disorder. But I really do caution, because the criteria that they've put out is that, for adults, we wouldn't think about diagnosing prolonged grief disorder before the 1 year mark after a death, which I more or less agree with. I certainly wouldn't be thinking about it any earlier than that. But for children, they say 6 months after a death, that, is when we would start, if a child was showing all of these really big symptoms related to grief. I even struggle to use that word symptom because it pathologizes it right there, that we'd be thinking that maybe they'd be diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder. And to me, that's very, very concerning. The idea that 6 months after a child's sibling or parent dies, that we might be considering a prolonged grief disorder. And again, the implications aren't as big in Canada, but I think it's a really important conversation to be having. And for me, the takeaway really tends to be that it's important to know, when grief is healthy, even though it's really hard, and when do we start to get concerned. And I can see that Colleen's put in a link to the Irish Child Bereavement Pyramid, which I think is phenomenal. I'll actually pull it up for next month, so I've got it in the slides as well, and we can look at it together for the folks who are here. But I think they've done a very good job in that pyramid of talking about the fact that, all kids at the base of the pyramid, they need access to accurate information, right? The 5 C's, knowing they're not responsible, all of these pieces, they need psychoeducational support. And then the tier, it goes up and up. It says, and then there's some kids who are really going to benefit from joining organized bereavement groups. Camp Aaron. Now, if I could do a rewrite of the child bereavement pyramid, I would say, all kids, like my experience, grief for kids, especially if it's an immediate family member who's died, is a sufficiently lonely experience for them because they probably don't have peers who have had a similar experience. You know, like, I don't recommend Camp Erin or a local bereavement group to just some of the kids that I work with. Like, across the board, I ask kids who have had someone close to them die, you know, is this something you'd be interested in? Because I think they can really benefit. But so while I would tweak it, I think the Irish Child Bereavement Pyramid has done a good job of showing. And then for some kids, they're really going to need individual counseling. There are some kids I would not be sending into a grief group or into a camp situation, especially if there's like a lot of trauma symptoms, easily triggered, without doing individual counseling first. And then there's some kids, when we get into, you know, struggles with suicidal ideation, self-harm, who are going to need even more specialized support at the top of that pyramid. I can see Ernie saying 6 months is very concerning, as that is before many firsts are experienced, and that is oftentimes when triggering of the intensity of grief is resurfacing. Yeah, I really do struggle with that criteria myself. And I do. And the other thing is that, like, the way kids grieve is so different to how adults grieve, and they grieve in chunks. They'll be in it. It's huge. They jump out, they go play, they have fun, they come back. But a child who's 4, how they understand their sibling's death when they're 6 is going to look very different. And so it's the most natural thing in the world. There's no pathology here, that a bunch of grief is going to surface when they start thinking about it differently, or they start grade 1 and they don't actually have a sibling at the school and some of their friends do. And these different situations come up. I can see, yeah, Darla saying as well, for loved ones in my community, 6 months is usually when one of the biggest waves of grief hits. Some acceptance and reality comes to the surface. At time of loss, they may stay so busy as a way to cope and avoid this reality, but waves continue, and big ones hit at 6 months and the 1 year since the loss. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I would echo that. I sometimes say to people, I find the 3 to 4 month mark is when things start getting really tough for the families, the people who are in the closest to the person who died, because there's this element of, you know, everybody else in the community sort of going back to normal. And for the people in the epicenter, there's no normal to go back to. Right. And exactly what Darla said, like that period of, I'm going to keep busy, or maybe even, you know, a relief. You know, dying takes longer than it has ever before in history, and we're in smaller families than ever before. So, you know, the caregiving and the toll can be really high, you know, sometimes for families too. And I like to normalize that for the families that I work with, that it's natural to feel some relief, you know, after somebody has died. And that doesn't in any way minimize your love for the person. And this tends to be, you know, way more heightened for people where, you know, it was a prolonged grief process. Or maybe there were struggles with somebody's mental health, and, you know, the family had been really worried about suicide, you know, for an extended period of time, and now it's actually happened. But I really like to validate for people that that's, you know, it can be natural to feel relief, and it doesn't in any way undermine your love for the person or your desire that things are different. But that too, I find for the first few months can be a part of the experience, and that 3 to 6 month mark can get really hard. I can see Darla saying here too, my nephew's 6, he lost an auntie beginning of March. He's going through feelings yet this month. He goes back to where she lived for his birthday week. So the family will be doing their best to celebrate him the way she used to. She made everyone feel so very loved. Thank you, Darla, for sharing that. Yeah, and that's where, you know, as 6-year-olds, I find are really amazing at balancing that deep joy and deep sorrow, you know, and going back and forth. And my hope is, you know, that there's lots of stories and memories of Auntie being told, you know, and I love that, you know, the family will be celebrating him the way she used to. And I think it's really healthy to make that explicit too. And we don't want to be tiptoeing around the conversation around Auntie, but, you know, what are some of the things that you remember that Auntie would do on your birthday as well? Any other questions? I know we're sort of at 9 minutes to the hour, and so I just want to make sure that if anybody came with specific questions or wonderings today, that we do actually get to them before we wrap up. Colleen and I will never run out of things to say, so like we'll just keep talking about stuff children's grief related, because it's where so much of our passion lies. But I do want to just sort of check in and see if there's anybody who's hoping, you know, or even that we can do a deeper dive on any of the pieces that we've talked about. Please, you know, throw in your question. I can see Leah from our team has also added our newsletter, where we just sort of send this out from the Andrea Warnick team, maybe 4 times a year if we're lucky. So we certainly won't be bombarding you, but with all our new favorite grief resources, if we've got courses, we always highlight this Q&A, favorite books of ours related to grief as well. So I'm not seeing any questions. I'm going to just sort of keep talking about some pieces. I know that Colleen has already mentioned this piece, but just around the fact that, you know, really in terms of kids' informational needs, like one of the best things we can do is invite kids to ask their questions. Let them know there's no bad questions, even if the question is, you know, when my brother dies, like who gets his stuff, right? Like sometimes it can be very sort of concrete, seemingly somewhat, you know, so focused on self-absorption and everything, but very natural for kids. And we really want to let them know that there's no bad questions. And as Colleen already mentioned too, you know, we just want to be clear with them, like, I might not know the answer, but maybe the oncologist does, maybe the homicide detective does. You know, I like to explicitly ask kids, is it okay if I go out and seek this answer and bring it back to you? And sometimes it's like one of the big wonderings, right? Or about, or the unanswered, like, why did my mom get cancer? And we can say like, I wonder about that too, you know, or maybe mom says like, I'm wondering about that too. But what we do know is this is not somebody's fault, you know, and I know, realize there's some situations where it is, or we know there's an environmental piece or any things like that. But for the most part, I'm often using the word mystery, right? That, you know, what we do know, and is going back to those 5 C's, that this isn't something that you did. This isn't something that mom did, you know, and so just really emphasizing those pieces and being honest when we don't have the answer, but still knowing that there's incredible utility and connection that can happen from wondering together. I can see Amina asking, will the recording be sent out? Yes, Virtual Hospice does send it out, I think within the week or so of it being recorded. Well, actually, I thought it did. And maybe some of the people here can actually let us know in the chat box if that's accurate or not. But what I do know is it's absolutely, it will be posted on the kidsgrief.ca website. So right now the March one is up there. I checked this morning, and then this one will be posted up in the next few days as well. And so you'll be able to get the April one for the next month. And then we've got a question here. My children's dad died from an aggressive cancer quite quickly, about 18 months ago. Now both grandfathers have been diagnosed with cancer, although quite treatable. What's the best way to talk to the kids about this? They're 9, 12, and 17. Colleen, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I first would imagine across 9, 12, and 17, 3 very different. Andrea was referencing, you know, different needs and wants for information, but that is where I would start, is just to have more information about both any sort of lingering wonderings, mysteries about dad's cancer, and now with the grandfather's cancer. So there are likely some overlaps. So starting with cancer, starting with cell development, reproduction, different cells have different jobs in the body. And they're constantly replacing themselves and growing new cells. Cancer cells are quite different in that they don't have a job to do. And they start to take a place of the healthy cells, stopping that part of the body from doing what it wants to do. It's a very simplistic explanation, but we could go into, I'm guessing, you know, at 12, at 17, at 9, probably a rooted understanding that they're coming from from biology class or health class, those kinds of things as well. There's lots of great videos, body books to support these conversations too. Often cancer is specific to particular parts of the body. So I would want to talk about what that is, what's being affected, as well as the options for treatment. So when grandparents' cancers are treatable, what are some of those treatments that are being tried? Also revisiting why were some of those not possible for dad and dad's cancer, so that there is an understanding there. Some cancers grow really quickly, or they're in a part of the body that can't be operated on, that the medications that are available are just not strong enough for that type of cancer to make that cancer go away. But the types of cancer and the information that they have about grandfather's cancers indicates at this point that there is treatment. So what are those treatment options? To talk about what is the plan, but also what are maybe some of the impacts of the treatment. It's usually what we're seeing is actually side effects of some of the treatments, in how it's going to impact their daily energy levels, appetite, those kinds of things as well. What would you add, Anne?
Yeah, and I think this is, this is one of the reasons. I mean, this is a really tough situation to have your dad die of an aggressive cancer and then both of your grandfathers being diagnosed with cancer. And that's where I do, from a grief perspective, I always sort of explore with teens and kids what some of the feelings in grief tend to be. And one of the things a lot of youth will sort of will resonate with a lot of youth is it's not fair, or it feels like the world is picking on me. And I kind of want to throw that out for your children. I'm wondering if this feels really, really unfair, or like the world's picking on us, and it's just, maybe giving them some of the language that they might not have. I find kids are pretty comfortable saying, yeah, that's what it feels like, or no, not at all. But I also think that I try across the board, particularly with cancer, to talk about the fact that, I know your dad died of cancer, but I also want you to know that, cancer is something that it does happen enough. We're going to know other people with cancer, and not everybody who gets cancer dies from cancer, which is a double-edged sword, because there could be some relief in that, but it also feels like, and it's so hard when your dad falls on the wrong side of those statistics, right? And that's where I just really be emphasizing going into the conversation too, like we're going to have hard conversations about some of the stuff that's going on in our family right now. But as you know, in our family, when hard stuff goes down, we're honest about it. And that's why I think it's so important to make sure the kids know that this is happening, and be able to say, I know that in the situation with dad, he did die from his cancer. And in sharing the information about their grandfathers having cancer, being able to be clear, like, fortunately, these cancers are quite treatable. And there's a really good chance they're going to be okay. And if that changes at any point, we're going to let you know. And we know there's a strong body of literature too that shows that, like, when we can preface that for kids or emphasize that, it brings down their anxiety. If they trust that, like, we're willing to have the conversation if things aren't going so well, that will really bring down their anxiety. So I'd just be really guided by honesty, letting them know you're not trying to hide anything from them. You're being honest. Fortunately, the situation for their grandfathers is that their cancers are quite treatable. And I realize it's a bigger conversation than we can get into right now. I'm happy to come back to it next month as well. I really, sometimes that language of treatable might be, we can treat it, but ultimately they will die from it, and versus curable. And that's where, given the ages of the kids, like, they might have some pretty direct questions, and their informational needs could be quite high. It's really personality driven as well. But I'd want to be really honest, because one of the big things they're going to be thinking, especially with their lived experience of dad dying, is, are our grandfathers going to die, or are they going to live? Right. And that's where it's important to be able to be honest about that. And let them know that if you are worried at any point that the treatments aren't working and that they might die, or one of them, you're going to let them know. So thank you for bringing that question forth, such an important one. And again, I'll leave everybody today just with, from that question, the sort of reminder that of the importance of having those conversations. I know most of us here, whether you're here personally supporting grieving children, professionally, a lot of the times the families we're supporting, somebody is dying or somebody has died. And that's where just emphasizing for them when it's an illness that they're likely, such as cancer, to know other people with the illness, but who might do well. Or for many of the families we work with too, when somebody has a suicide death, and perhaps they had a diagnosis of depression before. I really like to emphasize for the kids that I work with, the majority of people who have depression don't die by suicide. And unfortunately, usually the kid that I'm working with, that wasn't their reality, but they're going to know other people who are diagnosed with depression as well. And we want to make sure that their narrative is broader than, the experience that happened to them. So huge thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We will be back first Tuesday of the month, next month, May 2nd. Hard to believe we'll be into May then at 1 p.m. Big thanks to Colleen as well, and Leah for making her way back in and getting those links and everything else. Please take care of yourselves, and we hope to see you all next month. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Okay, forget how to stop the recording. Colleen, do you know how to stop the recording?